She stood in front of a room full of the most powerful investors in the world and told them she was building the future. She had a name, Luminar Systems. She had a number, $10 billion. She had a prototype, a roadmap, a board of directors, a press release and a headquarters with a glass facade and a reception area that cost more to design than most people earn in a decade. She had everything except the one thing that $10 billion was supposed to be paying for. The quantum computing technology did not exist. The company was a stage set. And for 4 years, Artemis Grant kept the curtain up. Welcome to corporate chaos scandals, the place for the most shocking and unbelievable workplace. Confession stories, from office drama to hidden secrets, nothing is off limits. Before we get into this, make sure you subscribe and like, because we bring you stories like this every week. Her name is Artemis Grant. She is 41 years old when this story ends in a federal courtroom. She was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, and educated at 3 different universities across 2 continents, a trajectory that was not the product of a coherent academic plan, but of the specific restlessness of someone who moved toward intellectual stimulation and away from anything that felt settled. She had degrees in physics and in business. She had a master's in computational mathematics from a university in the United Kingdom. She had the credentials of a woman who was genuinely intelligent and genuinely educated, and who had, across 20 years of adult life, never found an application for those credentials that fully absorbed her. She had worked in the technology sector. She had worked in finance. She had started 2 small companies, one a data consultancy, one a technology advisory practice, both of which had functioned modestly for a few years before closing, when the operational reality of running them day to day became less interesting than the idea of running them had been. She had never, in the honest account of her professional history, built anything that lasted. What she had built across those years was a reputation, not the reputation of someone with a track record of delivering. She did not have that. The reputation of someone who understood technology at a depth that most people in rooms where technology was being discussed did not, and who could present complex ideas with a clarity and a confidence that made those ideas feel not just credible but inevitable. She was the person in the room who understood what she was talking about at a level nobody else could contest, because the level at which the conversation operated was the level she had set. This is a specific and formidable quality. It is useful in any legitimate endeavor where you have something real to back it up. It is devastating in its damage potential when the thing you are presenting with clarity and confidence and apparent expertise is, underneath the presentation, nothing at all. The idea for Luminar Systems came to Artemis in the form of an observation rather than an invention. She had been following, for years, the public and private investment activity in quantum computing, the specific, contested, enormously consequential technology that promised to solve problems that classical computers could not approach. The observation was this: the investors who were moving money into quantum computing were almost without exception moving it on the basis of a technical understanding that was insufficient to evaluate what they were actually buying. They were buying the concept of quantum computing, the extraordinary, verified potential of the technology in its theoretical form, and attributing that potential to specific companies whose actual technical progress was in many cases far behind where the investment thesis required it to be. The market was buying hope, and hope Artemis understood. With the cold precision of someone who had spent 20 years watching how ideas moved money, was a product she knew how to supply. She was not at the point where this idea crystallized, planning to commit fraud. This is worth saying clearly, not because it excuses anything that followed, but because it explains the specific character of what she built. It was not constructed as a fraud from day one. It was constructed as an enterprise that progressively, deliberately, and with full awareness at each step chose deception over disclosure whenever the alternative was confronting the reality that the thing she was selling was not what she was saying it was. The distance between those two starting points produces the same destination, but it produces it differently. And the difference matters for understanding how someone gets from a credible person with genuine intelligence and genuine credentials to the central figure in what investigators eventually called the most expensive technology fraud in the history of private market investment. She incorporated Luminar Systems 18 months before the first major investor round. She hired, in the first 6 months, 17 people, physicists, engineers, computational mathematicians. These were real people with real expertise. Several of them had been recruited from legitimate quantum computing research programs. They were hired to do actual work. The work they were doing was real research. What it was not, what it had never been, and what Artemis knew it would not be within the timeline she was presenting to investors, was anywhere near the functional technology that the company's pitch materials described. The pitch materials described a proprietary quantum processing architecture that had achieved stable qubit coherence at room temperature. Room temperature. This is the technical qualification that, if real, would represent one of the most significant breakthroughs in the history of computing, an advance that would make practical quantum computing commercially viable in a way that no existing technology had achieved. Every major player in the field, universities, national laboratories, the technology giants with multi-billion-dollar quantum research programs, had been working on this problem for decades. Nobody had solved it. Artemis's materials said Luminar had solved it. She had not shown the technology to anyone who could verify the claim, because she had not shown anyone anything. The materials referenced proprietary IP, trade secret protection, and the operational security requirements of a company at a sensitive pre-commercialization stage. These are legitimate reasons for not demonstrating technology. They are also in the hands of someone who does not have the technology, the perfect screen. The first major investor round raised $200 million. The investors who participated were not naive people. They were experienced funds, technology-focused venture capital, growth equity, a sovereign wealth fund that had made several significant quantum computing investments. They conducted due diligence. They received documentation. The documentation was technically sophisticated, prepared with the assistance of a consultant Artemis had hired specifically to produce materials that would pass the level of scrutiny she anticipated. They were shown in a controlled demonstration environment. Equipment. The equipment looked exactly like the equipment should look. The demonstration produced results consistent with the claimed performance parameters. The demonstration had been designed with the assistance of one member of Artemis's technical team who understood what was being asked and made the choice to participate rather than walk away, to produce those results under the specific conditions of the demonstration without those results being reproducible under real operating conditions. It was, in the language of science, fabricated data. In the language of law, it was fraud. $200 million arrived in Luminar's accounts. Artemis paid her technical team. She paid the operational costs. She paid the consultant. She reinvested a significant portion into the research that was, in her internal account, to herself, still progressing toward the goal she had claimed was already reached. A position that became less coherent with each funding cycle, but that she maintained with the specific psychological persistence of someone who is committed to a version of reality and cannot, without catastrophic consequence, revise it. She also paid herself $34 million across the 4 years of the fraud's operation, distributed through a structure of consultancy agreements and IP licensing arrangements that were designed to make the personal extraction look like legitimate company expenditure. She bought a house in London, a house in Cape Town, an art collection that the receivers would later assess at $19 million. She flew private. She attended the events. She was photographed. She gave talks at technology conferences, where her name appeared on programs between the names of people who were doing the real work she was claiming to have already completed. She was, at the height of it, one of the most publicly credible figures in the quantum computing investment landscape. The second and third investment rounds followed the same pattern as the first. Each required more sophisticated fabrication than the last. The timeline for the claimed technology was advancing on paper, while the actual research was advancing far more slowly, and the gap between the two was widening in a way that required more elaborate justification with each cycle. Artemis managed this through a combination of increasingly dense technical documentation and the specific authority of someone who had, by this point, been presenting as an expert in a highly specialized field for 3 years, and whose reputation in investor circles was built on the cumulative weight of the preceding rounds. Investors who participated in later rounds were buying into a company that had passed through multiple previous rounds of due diligence. This social proof was among the most powerful instruments available to the fraud. If serious investors had committed in round 1 and serious investors had committed in round 2, then the serious investor, considering round 3, was operating in a context where someone else had already done the hard work of verification, that someone else had not, in fact, verified the thing that mattered. But the investor in round 3 did not know that. Total capital raised across 4 rounds and multiple debt and equity instruments. $10 billion. The Luminar Systems office, which the press covered as the physical embodiment of the quantum revolution, had cost $40 million to design and build. It had laboratories that looked like laboratories. It had server rooms that looked like server rooms. It had equipment that had been acquired, partially assembled, and positioned in ways that photographed correctly. It had the aesthetic vocabulary of a company that was building something real. The research team, which had grown to 43 people by the 4th year, most of whom were doing genuine work and had no knowledge of the fraud, occupied the laboratories and produced the papers and managed the experiments. Their work was real. Their results were not what the investor materials claimed. Several members of the team had, over the years, raised concerns internally about the gap between what they were achieving and what Artemis was representing externally. These concerns had been managed, some through reassurance, some through the specific authority of someone who controlled their employment, one through a conversation in which a researcher who had asked direct questions had been offered a significant salary increase and moved to a different project. The Ponzi structure underneath it all was not technically a Ponzi scheme in its classical form. It was not being operated by routing new investor money directly to old investors as returns. It was being operated by using new investor money to fund operations that maintained the appearance of a company that justified the previous investment, while simultaneously funding the personal extraction and the lifestyle that Artemis had built around the performance of success. The money coming in was being used to sustain the illusion that justified the money coming in. The circularity was the same. The mechanism was different. It could not go on indefinitely. Nothing built this way can. The question was always what would break it first. The answer was a journalist and a whistleblower arriving at the same conclusion from different directions at the same time. The journalist was Priya Maida, 34 years old, a technology correspondent for a major financial publication who had been assigned a profile piece on Luminar Systems and Artemis Grant that was intended to be a celebration of the company's trajectory. She spent 3 months reporting it. She spoke to 37 people. She visited the facility twice. She attended a press event at which Artemis delivered a keynote that received a standing ovation. And somewhere in the 3rd month of reporting, in a conversation with a former member of the technical team who had left the company 18 months prior and who was, in the careful and qualified language of someone who understood the risk of what they were saying, expressing doubts about the consistency between what the company's public materials described and what the team had actually achieved. Priya felt the specific sensation that certain journalists describe as the story shifting underneath their feet. What she had been writing was not the story was underneath it. She spent another 6 weeks. She spoke to 3 more former employees. She commissioned 2 independent physicists to review Luminar's published technical claims against the current state of the field. Both reviewers, in separate assessments with no knowledge of each other's conclusions, identified the same gap. The performance parameters Luminar claimed to have achieved were not achievable with any known approach within the described framework. The physics did not work. She had not yet published when she received a call from an investigator at the SEC. The SEC had received 6 weeks prior a formal whistleblower submission from an individual inside Luminar's finance department who had identified through the internal financial systems the structure of the personal extraction, the consultancy agreements and IP licensing arrangements through which $34 million had moved from company accounts to accounts controlled by Artemis. The submission included documented evidence. The SEC had been running a parallel investigation for 2 months before Priya's call arrived. They compared what they had, the technical evidence from the journalist's reporting and the financial evidence from the whistleblower submission, together constituted a picture that was, in the SEC's assessment, complete enough to act on. They acted. Artemis Grant was informed by her attorney that the SEC had issued an emergency asset freeze order on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in London. She had a dinner that evening. She attended it. People who were at that dinner described her as composed and engaged. One guest said she was the most interesting conversationalist at the table. Nobody knew what she had been told 4 hours before the first course arrived. She flew back to the United States the following morning. She met with her legal team for 4 hours. She said almost nothing. Her attorney would later describe this period as the most disciplined silence he had observed from a client facing the evidence package she was facing. The criminal indictment came 3 months later. 21 counts: securities fraud, wire fraud, investor fraud, obstruction of justice, money laundering. The evidence package was the most comprehensive the prosecuting attorney's office had assembled in a white-collar case in 5 years. The trial lasted 11 weeks. Priya Mehta's reporting was not evidence in the legal proceedings. Journalistic sources operate under protections that keep them separate from prosecutorial use. But the independent physicist assessments she had commissioned were, once verified by the prosecution's own experts, foundational to the technical case. The financial evidence from the whistleblower was precise and well documented. The $34 million personal extraction, traced entry by entry, told the story of a person who had been using investor capital as personal income from the earliest stages of the operation. Artemis gave a brief statement before sentencing. She said the technology was real. She said the timeline had been optimistic rather than fabricated. She said she had believed in what she was building and had made errors of judgment in how she communicated the company's progress. The judge said nothing about this for a long moment. Then she said, $10 billion in investor capital, $34 million in personal extraction, fabricated demonstration data, and a research timeline you knew at every stage was not supported by your team's actual progress. This is not a case of optimistic communication. It is one of the most sustained and deliberate deceptions this court has encountered. Artemis Grant was sentenced to 25 years. She was the first person to make a full statement as she was led from the courtroom. She said nothing. The London house was seized. The Cape Town house was seized. The art collection, all $19 million of it, was seized. The private jet arrangement was terminated. The Luminar Systems office, the glass facade building with the laboratories that looked like laboratories and the server rooms that looked like server rooms, was handed to a receiver. The research team, whose work had been real even when the framework around it was not, were offered positions by 3 legitimate quantum computing firms that had been watching Luminar's technical hires for years. Most of them moved on. 2 of them, using the genuine research they had conducted inside Luminar under conditions they now understood fully, published a paper 18 months later that made a modest but verifiable contribution to the field. The technology in its real form progressed, slowly, as it always had, as it will for years yet. Artemis Grant is serving her sentence. The future she said she was building is being built by other people. They are doing it the real way. That is the story of Artemis Grant and Luminar Systems. $10 billion. A stage set with laboratories. And the journalist and the whistleblower who walked through the curtain from different directions and found the same empty room. Drop a comment below. What is it about quantum computing specifically, or about any technology that sounds just beyond what anyone can easily verify, that makes it such fertile ground for this kind of fraud? because Artemis understood the psychology of that better than almost anyone. Tell me where you land on this one, and share it, because there are investors writing checks right now based on demonstrations that nobody in the room is technically equipped to verify. And if you are not subscribed to corporate chaos scandals, right now is the moment. Hit that subscribe button. Like this video. We are here every single week with the stories that the glossy press conferences never tell you. I'll see you in the next one. Next.